am joined by Jonah, Michea, Judy, and Nicole, Celeste, Anderson here virtually in the Folk Roots studio. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here with me today.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Always a pleasure. Jonah, Michea, Judy, and I have had an interview before on Ear to the Ground, featured by Matthew Finch, but I am really happy to have you on Folk Roots. How would you describe the folk influences in your music?
It goes way back. Like, I have people still sprinkled all over this country, indigenous and colonizer people mixing together with a complex multi-generational perspective on what folk music is. My great-grandfather, Oval Gunter, was a bluegrass guitarist who was missing fingers, who played on WNCW in West Asheville, which is a station I was on when I first started playing, and it's definitely a thing that's part of me. I mean, the last interview we did was for Appalachian Grandbaby, which was 2 years ago.
On the folk subject, so Michea and I are collaborators of all sorts. We're also partnered, married, have 3 children. But I met him in 2004 in Asheville, North Carolina. So if you want some folk context, there's some folk context. But his great-grandmother, Ollie, is the one married to Oval. Is that correct? So his great-grandfather, Oval, was married to his great-grandmother, Ollie. And I actually took care of Ollie in North Carolina when she was 96 years old. And she was always singing these funny old songs. She had a really strong accent, and she taught both of us how to make biscuits and gravy. And she just had all kinds of very specific stories. So when I think of folk, the previous interview, Appalachian Grandbaby, so the way that title came from was we were like imitating old bluegrass and how it's so super fast, like blang, 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 and we were comparing it to punk. And so I remember saying something like, Bluegrass is the great-grandfather of punk, and then that transferred over to the title Appalachian Grandbaby. So, like, Michea and I are constantly in this creative collaboration around titles and lyrics and album art and music videos to the point that sometimes we forget who was the originator of a thought. And I'm often very confident that it was me, and he'll like remember it as his own thought. I'm like, dude, I gave that album title
That
to
was
you.
Me.
Yeah. So
Not bad.
Anyway, this album is a cool progression of that same thought process in Agoraphobics. Yeah. I am not the writer of Michea's music, but I have witnessed him writing music for 16 years. And so it's really cool to watch the progression of his music. But I feel like there are definitely folk relationships. So anyway,
Right.
I'm going to...
No, and I appreciate that answer. I am a blender of things on Folk Roots. And I'm like, yes, exactly. And that's why it's on Folk Roots. Ha!
When you have folk roots, you have to reckon with that. You know, like, what's your cultural context? How are you being censored in your folk roots? And if you want to be a punk rocker, how are you speaking out against that in folk music? And then how does it transubstantiate when people listen to it? And I've kind of just been watching how people react to different records that I put out. And, you know, I started everything really super shrouded in metaphor and trying to experience my own self. And I used recordings as placeholders for emotional processes that maybe I wasn't even ready to look at yet, because folk, you know, that's having dreams of music. It's having trauma coded in music and family stories coded in music. And my subconscious feels like this motivator for a lot of my writing, and then later I'll release a record and then wait a couple years and then I'll listen to some of it and I'll be like, okay, yeah, that's where I was at and this is where I'm going. So Agoraphobics,
that's where I was, right?
Yeah. This new record is, for me, more of a cognitive process, more saying, okay, I can allow myself to rhyme in couplets, I can allow myself to have some songs in 4/4 and sing about stuff that's pretty straightforward that also I'm going to feel okay about later on.
Well, I'm very much looking forward to airing some of Agoraphobics tracks on today's Folk Roots show and creating sort of the branches to the Folk Roots and that grandbaby that is totally punk rock.
Yeah. Ollie used to sing this one song. Well, it was one afternoon. Like, I would catch her off guard. My great-grandma, she was 96, and she would be singing something. All of a sudden, one day she said, "First stepped up, little mighty grew. Come home with me tonight. I can tell by the ring that's on your finger that you're Lord Daniel's wife. He cut her head right off of her shoulders and kicked it against the wall." And I was like, "Grandma, what did you say?" And she's like, "Nothing, honey."
Nothing. And we were like, sing it again, and she wouldn't do it. I ended up, from the Hendersonville Library, finding an old song book that had a compilation of Scotch-Irish root songs and Appalachian songs and the overlap and how they changed. But yeah, that song was in there, Lord Byron.
Yeah, there are so many different versions of all those old songs because they just get passed around through families and stuff.
Oh, yeah. And then passed overseas and entirely transformed, right.
And then they grow different branches in those.
On that folk root tree. I love it. I love this.
The library in that town, I played a concert there one time with like a bunch of teenage metal bands, and I was the only acoustic act. And it
Speaking
was
of
weird.
Punk and Hendersonville and folk, you know,
whatever.
Perfect. No, it's a good segue.
Right. At the local library, you're hearing, you know, the teenage heavy metal bands and Micah Judy on.
Micah has been playing these like library shows in these little towns at random times for such a long time, and I feel like now it's a pandemic, so it's not like there's the rock scene to go to, that it's like really hard to tie in to everybody else, especially if you don't want to like compromise like your basic needs, you know, like we're choosing to have children, and so we're not like on the road forever, you know. So anyway,
yeah, so you can't put that baby on the road right now, especially, but even when you have babies at home, it's hard to take that show on the road. Let's go on tour.
One of the songs off this album, our youngest is 2.5, and when he had a mix done with it, she was like, "Mom, dance with me. Mom, dance with me." And then she would not let me walk away until we had headbanged to this one song like 5 times. So maybe that's the next song. Like, what song was that? That was Post-War News.
Post-War News, yeah.
Is that a good Post-War News moment?
Probably.
Well, yeah.
That's a banger.
Like the blood off of your 9-inch heel.
term folk music is a term that has frustrated me in the past when certain bands claim to be folk who I'm not really into. Well, there has to be choosing how you feel about a genre and then how you want to make the genre continue.
Totally.
Like, my favorite part of music is the sharing an emotional experience with a stranger. Like when people reach out to me on YouTube or email through my website or whatever, and they just say, I really loved this. This made me feel this way. And, you know, do you want to collaborate? Like, that's part of my favorite stuff.
That's great. That's a perfect segue to my next question. Last time we got together, you mentioned like sending recordings to your friends and having them add bits onto it and send it back to you. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah.
Have you been doing any of that on this album? And I don't know if maybe you have some advice from that prior experience to musicians trying to collaborate right now.
Yeah.
That's a good question.
It is. I've been nomadic for a long time, and geographical isolation has been a big theme, and underhousing has been a big theme, and homelessness, and so I had to learn how to make a record with a full band without having a full band in a room at the same time on Appalachian Grandbaby 2 years ago, and on Agoraphobics now. I've kind of honed the process down even more. Before, it was like a 3 or 4 year process, just like I've got this bassist friend in Raleigh, and I've got this drummer friend in Flagstaff, and I've got this other friend in Israel or whatever, like it was a global collaboration. And this one was more like, okay, here are the songs. I recorded everything to a click. I think that's the main thing. If people want to get drums on a record without being with the drummer, I found this great drummer, Daniel Langdorf, in Flagstaff, and I sent him my songs to a click, and we wrote the drums together. I would, send him a recording like, can you do this while I'm doing that first part, and then he would be like, yep, and for me, the main thing is,
Wow.
Can you find somebody who you can speak that language with? And I think I did on this record, because I would like drum and, ding, hit a cup or whatever, and he would understand how that translated to the ride or the toms or the kick. And so Daniel went into the studio for a day in May. We had the session scheduled before the pandemic, and so he was recording in Arizona while we were shut down here, and then he sent the drums to me. Then it was just a matter of working with my own scratch tracks and layering new guitars, layering new bass, replacing parts where the performance was off originally, and kind of ironing everything out and smoothing it out to make it a full band record. And I would bring the songs to Nicole and say, are these guitars overpowering? Is this vocal getting lost? Like, how is this chorus working?
And you're doing it all yourself, and just by sound and just by listening.
Right, I play by ear. I'm not classically trained. The drummer was listening to my ramblings, and I played bass and electric guitar, and I did vocals and synthesizer on this album. I recorded everything except the drums, and I mixed it. Well, it just got mastered. So we're about ready to put it out. The release date is Halloween, which is a full moon.
Ooh. Oh, no, that's so exciting. And before that, you were, even dabbling and then mastering yourself. And I just think that it's a relatable struggle. Everybody is doing everything right now and virtually, and easier for some than for others out of a pure accessibility. And so then you compound that with a housing struggle, and that's a shared experience right now, especially. I mean, being evicted is something that's sort of hovering over us all, I think.
Right. The country is in crisis. There are waves of evictions. There's a housing crisis. There's a temporary housing crisis. And collaborating can still happen, and we need to know that some people have limitations based on context, and it's been really hard. I know a lot of musicians who play for a living, and I wanted to play concerts this summer, but I couldn't. to raise money for the record. And usually I'll hire an engineer to do more than what I was able to hire one to do this year. So yeah, you gotta homeschool yourself. The album should be up on all the major streaming services on Halloween. That's the plan. We're sitting right now in a tiny house that I built us to transition us out of homelessness 8 years ago, that I pretty much used as a studio to record this whole album.
Yeah, wow, that's incredible.
And I think that Micah, in the context of speaking more directly, he was thinking about calling it narratives and metaphor.
Narrative and metaphor.
Narrative and metaphor. And it's just funny, I was just thinking about how, in the context of this radio show being folk music, giving himself permission to speak more in direct narrative, I think that has some folk elements to it. Folk songs are often telling stories and being more direct. And so this is really a dramatic shift in his songwriting style to, one, even include me in the songwriting process.
This being a little bit more transparent in your narrative. I agree with it's just a song. It's the world's now. It's not mine anymore, but it'll always be yours. And the more yours it is, the better it is. The more of, a folk song, I think it is, because that is just like singing the blues, and you're got the blues and you sing about your blues, and everybody else with the blues can sing that song.
Yeah.
It has been just really great talking with both of you, and I miss you, and having you in the studio. I wish I could have met Nicole in person.
It marked an era. Thank you for having us.
I don't know how everything's going to shift. I have some friends who are like, well, maybe it'll be over in the spring. I'm like, it will not be over in the spring. But, this long-term adaptation we're doing, we're going to have to keep figuring it out. But I really feel like part of my art practice right now is community making and connection making. And I really value speaking with you too. And I hope someday I'll be on here with my own album. But
oh, you will.
In the being kind to yourself, I think of folk as a way of recalling that we are not severed from context. Right. And so, part of being kind to yourself has to do with really contextualizing yourself. If you put yourself in a vacuum, then you can give yourself all kinds of negative self-talk. But when you actually put yourself in context, it's a lot easier.
That would be great to have you back as, in another way. And thank you both so much.
Drew some conclusions until my marker frayed. Hard to get old pain to act its age. Hey sugar, where's my cane? I've been embracing for impact since the 0 grade. Oh honey, so many pairs of jeans in my veins, holes in helices through which you can see my legs. to some conclusions until my marker frayed. Hard to kill old pain to act its age.